The first story. Recalling these memories is not easy at all because they are also the nightmares of my past. I was born and raised in the countryside, surrounded by vast paddy fields and waterways. As children in our neighborhood, we often played together, usually venturing out to the fields and river. Our outings to the fields were only for catching grasshoppers to throw or collecting snails to boil and eat. We didn't go herding buffalo or anything like that. Personally, I loved the summer season the most when we all went to the river to cool off, a feeling that can't be described. The river we usually swam in was near our house, about 2 kilometers away. This river was surrounded by thick vegetation on both banks. Our favorite spot for swimming was an area with many water coconut trees, which we called the coconut garden. It was very refreshing there because of the shade from the trees, and there were steps leading down from the bank about 1 meter to the river. When we were younger, we could swim by using those steps. Across from the coconut garden was a resort for tourists. Next to this coconut garden, there was a small canal that connected to the river, forming a river junction. This canal was quite shallow, its depth was only about 1 meter, except when the water level was very high. That day was just a normal summer day. We gathered together to go swimming in the river as usual. Everything was going fine until B, instead of swimming, wandered around and started picking up rocks to throw into the dry canal. When he looked down at that dried up canal, he screamed, "Oh my God! Hey, Q, my name. Look. It looks so much like H, the guy who lives next to D." While screaming, he burst into tears. The rest of us didn't understand what was going on or why this crazy guy was screaming about H in such a manner. We had to swim back to the shore to see what had happened. This river wasn't very wide, it was about 14 to 15 meters from one bank to the other, and its depth was around 6 to 7 meters. As we reached the shore, we immediately ran to where B was kneeling because he couldn't stand up. All of us started shouting together, making more noise than a bustling market in the vast deserted fields. I still get chills when I remember this scene. H didn't know how to swim, and he had never gone near the river before. H was already 23 years old. But for some reason, unknown to us, H had thrust his head into that muddy pile in the canal and died. When we found him, he had probably been dead for over half a day. His head was stuck in the mud since the water had dried up. Standing above and looking down, we saw him in a posture as if he was crawling, but his head was buried in the mud. At that moment, we all screamed and ran away, none of us brave enough to stay. We ran back to inform the adults so they could retrieve his body. H's mother came to the river, crying bitterly because in the morning of that day, he had told her he was going to buy breakfast like every other day, but he hadn't returned by noon. After this incident, our parents prohibited us from going to swim in the river. Speaking of the ban, well, we forgot about it after about 2 weeks, and we resumed our regular river swimming routine. Then, about a month later, another person died. This guy was a good swimmer. He rowed a boat and docked it in the coconut garden area somehow, but the boat capsized, and he drowned. It's hard to believe that a good swimmer could drown, right? But this incident happened when I wasn't there, so I can't provide detailed information. Please understand, guys. After that guy's death, we became scared and didn't dare to swim in the river frequently anymore. We used to swim 3 times a week, but now it became once every 2 weeks. Then, exactly 1 month later, an elderly lady died right at the coconut garden. She took a boat to cut grass for her cows to eat. But for some reason, she died. Her body was found sitting, hugging her legs, under the same steps I mentioned earlier. From that point on, we were too afraid to go near that section of the river. Even now, the younger generations who grew up later never dare to swim there. Then, not long after that, there were 2 brothers. The older brother was about 43 years old, and the younger brother was around 40. The older brother was one of the best swimmers in our village. The younger brother, on the other hand, couldn't swim even a little bit, not even as well as young children. On that day, I was playing video games and rode my bike across a large bridge, about 700 meters away from the coconut garden. Since I lived in this village, I had to ride to the neighboring village to play video games because there was a shop there. I rode across the bridge around noon. At around 12 o'clock, I saw the 2 brothers gathering water hyacinths to feed the ducks. The older brother was holding a rope and swimming to the middle of the river to tie the rope to the water hyacinths, while the younger brother pulled them back to the shore. After playing for about 40 minutes, I saw someone running into the internet cafe, shouting that someone had died in the river, urging everyone to go and see. When I arrived at the scene, I didn't see anyone, just the rope and the water hyacinths with a pair of flip-flops on the shore. At a glance, I recognized that they belonged to the 2 brothers I had just seen. I asked around and found out that the older brother was swimming to the middle of the river, tying the rope to the water hyacinths when suddenly, it seemed like someone pulled him down from under the water in one go. He struggled to hold onto the large mass of water hyacinths to float and shouted loudly, causing many people passing by the bridge to hear him say, "Help me. Someone is pulling my leg." Oh, that's messed up. Everyone on the bridge at that time was mostly women and children, so they just stood there screaming and no one dared to jump in and rescue them. Seeing that, the younger brother of Mr. L jumped in, hoping to save his brother. But I guess he forgot the most important thing: he couldn't swim. One person gasping for breath and struggling to resurface continuously, and no one could save them, let alone two people. Eventually, within a short time, about 3 minutes of struggling with that ghostly creature, both of them sank deep into the river. When I arrived, I saw some guys passing by in a boat, and they heard people on the bridge screaming for help because the two guys were under the river. The guys in the boat took turns diving to search, but by evening, they still hadn't found anything. At this point, the families of the two guys came to the river, crying and wailing. It was a very tragic scene that made everyone's hearts overflow with tears. I went back home at midnight, and when I woke up in the morning, no one was searching anymore. The families of the two guys hired a spiritual master to perform a ritual using their old clothes. After a while, the old clothes of the two guys floated on the river and reached a clump of coconut trees right at the base of the bridge. Then the spiritual master called for someone to jump down and search near the tree trunk, and they retrieved the bodies of the two guys. No one paid attention to that clump of coconut trees, even though sometimes bodies would float down the river and reach that particular tree. When the two guys died, there were already 15 bodies, but no one really cared about that tree trunk. However, after these two guys died, the coconut tree became more eerie in the eyes of everyone. Then, after a week, a pregnant girl, abandoned by the despicable guy who didn't want to take responsibility for their child, jumped into the river, even though it was a section of the river far away from the coconut tree. But her body ended up floating right at the base of the coconut tree. The horrifying thing was that even though the water was flowing rapidly, the body didn't move. Then, on that day, the people living nearby discussed it among themselves and decided to cut down that coconut tree. But every time someone took a saw, their arm would break, or the saw would break completely. Even with knives, axes, and all sorts of tools, the result was just broken limbs. Chopping the tree caused it to bleed, and I witnessed it with my own eyes. It was horrifying beyond words. Everyone was helpless. They invited spiritual masters to come and perform rituals or deal with it. But when they saw the coconut tree trunk, every one of them shook their heads in silence and left. There was even a fake spiritual master who, after performing the ritual, went crazy and was admitted to a mental hospital. One day, while I was driving on the bridge, I noticed a pair of sandals, a mobile phone, and a piece of paper with something written on it that I didn't read. There were many people standing on the bridge, looking down at the river, so I could guess what had happened. Out of curiosity, I stayed to watch, along with my friends, who often swam in the river together. By midnight, the ambulance and divers had arrived long ago. The divers had been diving for 3 hours and were exhausted. They were sitting on the bank, smoking cigarettes, as they were completely helpless. The wife of this man was sitting on the shore and eventually fainted from crying too much. It was known that this man had accumulated a large gambling debt with the underworld and chose suicide as a way out. At that moment, I looked at the wife and felt so sorry for her that tears welled up in my eyes. I turned my face away to avoid witnessing that scene. Then, I looked out at the calm and peaceful river and noticed something floating gently, swaying like a coconut. In my mind, I thought and said out loud for anyone present to hear, "Oh, that looks like a coconut." It was like I was talking to myself, not intending for anyone to hear. But because it was a quiet night, everyone heard and looked out at the river. At that moment, I was still in a daze when a diver looked out at the river and immediately jumped in. He swam toward that coconut and pulled out a human corpse. Oh my God, it turned out that the coconut I saw was the head of the person who had committed suicide. Since the body was standing under the river, the head protruded like a coconut. It was rare to see a drowned person's body standing upright like that. When they retrieved the body, the man's family embraced the corpse and cried, and blood gushed out of his mouth. It was a gruesome sight, and I couldn't bear to watch anymore. I quickly got in the car and drove away. Time passed by, and the coconut tree was struck by lightning. On that day, when it wasn't raining, I was playing at home when I heard a loud crash. Since my face was turned towards the river, I saw a lightning bolt striking the riverbank. When I drove to the scene, I saw that the coconut tree had been struck by lightning. It was engulfed in a fierce fire, and I could hear screams echoing as if they were from the realm of the dead. Many people who were there heard it, not just me. After the lightning struck the coconut tree, people brought saws, and it was cut down easily and normally, without any strange occurrences. Since then, no bodies have drifted to the base of that coconut tree. Instead, they have shifted to a clump of nearby trees. The second story. In November, my parents decided to take a vacation at the KB Hot Spring Resort. We had become familiar with this place after every month-long holiday. This time, as it was winter, the resort seemed quieter than usual. My grandparents were assigned a room on the second floor of a two-story building with around 10 rooms per floor. I was surprised to notice that only 1 to 2 rooms on the lower floor were occupied, the last rooms in the building. My mother questioned my father about it, but he dismissed it and said it didn't matter where we stayed. My father was usually calm and didn't pay much attention to such trivial matters. After arranging our belongings and cleaning up, while I was washing my face, my mother hung a towel on the line and securely fastened it. However, when she turned back, she was surprised to see the towel lying on the floor. She started feeling a bit worried. As night fell and the air became damp, my father tried to turn on the light, but the bulb didn't light up. My mother, being superstitious, disliked unexplainable incidents. Suddenly, she saw a shadow pass by the door. She thought to herself that there must be someone else on this floor, at least reducing the fear. She called my father to ask that person for a light to light a candle and find out more. He complied with her request. When he returned, he said there was no one there, and he had checked the entire row of rooms but found no one. My mother began to suspect, but she still insisted that my father check the row of rooms once again and then go down to the security room to borrow a light and replace the bulb. They both walked along the corridor, lighting paper to illuminate their way, but they didn't find any rooms with occupants. Finally, the security staff managed to replace the bulb. However, the candle suddenly became weak and went out. At that moment, my mother asserted to my father that there was a spirit in the room. As my mother had become frightened, my father tried to speak louder and suggested waiting until the next morning to change rooms. That night felt like an endless one as my mother couldn't close her eyes. Before going to bed, she prepared herself by having a knife and a basin of urine. According to folklore, these could ward off evil spirits. By her side, she prayed, saying, "If there is a spirit in this room, please stop tormenting us so that tomorrow I can buy rice, salt, incense to offer and burn for the spirit." Right after finishing the prayer, my mother closed her eyes for a long while. Suddenly, she woke up, shook my father, and said, "I just had a dream." It was a mother holding a newborn baby, with bright red skin, standing right next to the bed. My father turned on the light to reassure her and checked the room from top to bottom. He said there was nothing there and believed it was just a vague hallucination, then went back to sleep immediately. From that moment until morning, my mother couldn't fall asleep. Early in the morning, while it was still dark, my grandparents went to the market to buy offerings. After finishing their purchases, around 7:30 a.m. at that time, they packed their belongings, taking their own blankets and curtains everywhere, to go downstairs and change rooms. As my mother folded the hotel's blanket to return it, some buttons on the side of the blanket popped open. And, oh no, a large patch of dried blood had turned dark. At that moment, my mother screamed and threw the blanket away. Security guards, receptionists, and others came over. My mother showed them the blanket. The receptionist apologized and then said that not long ago, a woman had died there during childbirth. My mother became furious and demanded to write a complaint to the newspaper about this lack of hygiene. She recounted the story of the ominous dream. The manager had to come and apologize profusely. Feeling perplexed. In the end, my family returned home, ending the vacation. The third story. My hometown is a poor village located on the banks of a peaceful river. That river has long become an indispensable part of my memories, my friends' memories, and even the memories of other poor people here. It flows from a high source, passing through villages and communes, and becomes a bridge connecting the two riverbanks. One day in September, after the flood days, the sky gradually brightened and the river's water level receded. Despite modernization, the ferry remained an important means of transportation, connecting the villages and communes together. A heart-wrenching tragedy occurred when a person caused an accident that led the ferry to sink, taking away the lives of 11 people. The whole village sank into sorrow, and grief spread across the river. Since then, many strange and eerie stories have circulated about the riverbank that year. At first, I hated those stories and considered them mere pranks to scare children. My father always affirmed that ghosts did not exist, and strange phenomena only appeared in unstable minds. However, one summer night the following year, I had a bizarre experience. After playing football and having a cheerful drink with friends, I decided to go home earlier. It was quite late at night. Under the moonlight, I felt the tranquility and immersed myself in the silent space of the river. But when I stepped into the water, I felt a strange sensation, as if something was entangled in my leg, causing fear. I tried to take deep breaths and wash my face in the water to stay alert, but that feeling seemed to disappear. However, in the silence, I heard a buzzing sound behind me, as if someone was swimming. When I looked back, I saw pale faces with expressionless eyes, struggling to swim behind me. A horrifying feeling ran down my spine. However, I managed to cross the river and escape that feeling. On the sandy shore, I felt exhausted and fainted. When I woke up, only the sound of my heavy breathing filled the silent space. I looked towards the riverbank and saw a group of people under the moonlight, looking at me with a mixture of sadness and resentment in their eyes. I sympathized with those people, innocent souls, lying desolate in the cold depths of the river. On the lonely path back home, I walked alone in the late night. All the houses had their lights turned off as everyone went to sleep, and only the sound of barking dogs pierced through the silent air. Despite feeling tired, I felt the anticipation for my family, and the lights in my house were still brightly lit. I only hoped that the ferryman had been more responsible and didn't overload the boat. I hoped that my hometown wasn't too impoverished to have a bridge, so that no one would have to lie beneath the cold river anymore. In the tranquil countryside, sleep embraced everyone, with only the moonlight shining brightly overhead.